Australia, 46,000 years ago. A small group of people, the first humans ever to set foot on this continent, moves carefully through a landscape unlike anything their ancestors had ever seen. The trees are wrong. The sky is wrong. The animals are wrong. Everything here evolved in isolation for tens of millions of years, cut off from the rest of the world by thousands of kilometers of open ocean. These people crossed that ocean on rafts and canoes, driven by curiosity, by necessity, by the restless human hunger to see what lies beyond the horizon. They are brave beyond measure. They are also completely unprepared for what is waiting for them. The megafauna of ancient Australia makes the African savanna look almost tame by comparison. There are wombats the size of rhinoceroses. There are kangaroos 3 meters tall. There are marsupial lions with slicing carnassial teeth unlike anything alive today. There are giant flightless birds with crushing beaks that could split bone like dry wood. But none of these animals, not one, would have inspired the particular cold terror that came from knowing that something out there in the eucalyptus scrubland was watching you. Something patient. Something that had been perfecting the art of ambush predation for millions of years before the first human being ever drew breath. Something that weighed as much as a modern saltwater crocodile. Something that could outrun a human being over short distances. Something whose saliva, or more accurately, whose mouth, was a delivery mechanism for bacteria and venom that could kill even if the initial strike did not. Its scientific name is Varanus priscus, but history knows it by another name, Megalania, the giant ripper lizard. And this is its story. Now, before we go any further, I want you to understand the scale of what we are talking about. Because when I say giant monitor lizard, your brain might conjure an image of something like a large Komodo dragon, maybe 1.5 meters long. Scary enough in a zoo enclosure, but manageable. Something you could theoretically outrun if you had enough open ground and a good head start. That is not what Megalania was. The size estimates for Varanus priscus have been one of the great debates in Australian paleontology for the better part of a century. And the reason the debate is so fierce and so fascinating comes down to a fundamental problem with the fossil record. Megalania did not preserve well. The bone fragments we have recovered are fragmentary, scattered, often isolated. We have no complete skeleton. We have no single site where an entire animal was preserved in articulated form, the way some dinosaur specimens are preserved, giving us clean, unambiguous measurements. What we have instead are pieces. And from pieces, scientists must reconstruct a whole animal. The early estimates were extraordinary. Ralph Molnar, the Queensland Museum paleontologist who spent decades as the world's leading expert on Megalania, produced estimates in the range of 5.5 to 7 meters in total length. At the upper end of that range, you were talking about an animal roughly the size of a large saltwater crocodile, but built like a lizard, built to move on land, built to pursue and ambush terrestrial prey. Later analyses, including work published by researchers Brian Fry and colleagues, examining the biomechanical constraints of varanid locomotion, suggested somewhat more conservative estimates, perhaps 4.5 to 5.5 meters for a large adult male. Even the conservative estimates, however, produce an animal of staggering proportions. At 5 meters and perhaps 300 kilograms, Megalania would have been the largest terrestrial lizard to walk the Earth since the extinction of the non-avian. Think about what that means for a moment. 66 million years of terrestrial vertebrate evolution. Mammals rising, diversifying, conquering every ecological niche on every continent. And yet in Australia, in this isolated island continent where evolution played by different rules, a lizard managed to grow to a size that no lizard anywhere else on Earth had achieved in the entire Cenozoic era. That is not an accident. That is a story. And the story is about what happens when you take a lineage of already formidable predators and give them tens of millions of years of isolation, abundant prey, and no competition from the large mammalian carnivores that were reshaping ecosystems everywhere else. The Varanid lineage, the family of monitor lizards, originated in Asia, probably during the Cretaceous period. By the Miocene epoch, roughly 23 to 5 million years ago, Varanids had spread across much of the Old World. The ancestor of Megalania likely reached Australia during a period when land connections or very short water crossings made the journey possible. Once there, cut off from the rest of the world's evolving ecosystems, the Australian Varanids began their own evolutionary journey. The result, after millions of years, was Megalania. Dr. Steve Rowe of the University of New South Wales, one of the leading researchers in Australian Pleistocene megafauna, has described Megalania as almost certainly the apex predator of Pleistocene Australia, at least among terrestrial animals. In ecosystems where the largest carnivorous mammals were marsupials, not placental predators, a large varanid with the hunting strategies already encoded in its lineage could achieve ecological dominance that would be unthinkable in Africa or Asia. And here is the thing about varanid hunting strategies that makes Megalania so different from, say, a large constrictor snake or even a saltwater crocodile. Varanids are active hunters. They are not ambush predators in the pure crocodilian sense, lying motionless for hours, conserving energy, waiting for prey to come within strike range. They can ambush, yes, they do ambush, but they are also capable of active pursuit. They have relatively high metabolic rates for reptiles. They have a forked tongue that functions as a sophisticated chemosensory organ, sampling the air for scent particles and delivering information to the Jacobson's organ in the roof of the mouth, essentially giving the animal a directional chemical map of its environment. A Komodo dragon can detect carrion from a distance of up to 9.5 kilometers under the right wind conditions. Scale that sensory apparatus up to a 7-meter animal, and you have something that can find you long before you can see it. But let us return to those first humans on that ancient Australian shore. The question that haunts this entire story, the question that researchers are still debating today, is this: did Megalania and early humans coexist? Did they meet? Did those first Australians look up from their campfire one night and see something moving at the edge of the firelight? Something enormous, something slow and deliberate, something that stopped and tasted the air with a long, forked tongue. The dating question is everything here, and for decades it was genuinely unresolved. The oldest confirmed human presence in Australia, based on the most robust archaeological evidence, including the Majid Bebe rock shelter site in the Northern Territory, excavated and reanalyzed by researchers including Chris Clarkson of the University of Queensland, dates to approximately 65,000 years ago, with a conservative mainstream estimate of around 50,000 to 65,000 years ago. The last confirmed Megalania specimens, based on uranium series dating of fossil material, have been dated to approximately 40,000 years. Some estimates suggest the species may have persisted even later in certain refugia. Do the math. Even using conservative estimates for both timelines, there is an overlap, a potentially substantial overlap. These two species, the giant lizard that had ruled this continent for millions of years, and the small, clever primates who had just arrived from across the sea, were almost certainly alive at the same time, on the same landmass. The question of whether they encountered each other, of whether early Australians hunted Megalania, feared it, fled from it, painted it on rock walls, incorporated it into the earliest mythologies of the oldest continuous human culture on Earth, is one of the most tantalizing mysteries in the entire history of human prehistory. And over the course of this video, we are going to dig into every layer of that mystery. We are going to examine the fossil evidence, what it tells us, what it cannot tell us, and why the fragmentary nature of Megalania's remains has produced a century of scholarly disagreement about even basic facts like its size and the precise mechanics of how it killed. We are going to look at the ecological context, the world of Pleistocene Australia, an ecosystem so strange and so unlike anything alive today that reconstructing it feels almost like writing science fiction, except that every detail is grounded in bone and pollen cores and isotopic analysis. We are going to examine the coexistence question with the seriousness it deserves, not as sensationalism, not as a claim that ancient humans were constantly being terrorized by giant lizards, but as a genuine scientific and archaeological puzzle with profound implications for how we understand the relationship between human arrival and megafauna extinction in Australia. And we are going to look at the extinction itself, because Megalania is every single individual of this extraordinary species has been dead for roughly 40,000 years. And the question of why, climate, habitat change, human hunting pressure, cascading ecological collapse, is not merely an academic question. It is a question about what humans do to ecosystems when we arrive. It is a question that resonates across the entire span of human prehistory, from Australia to the Americas, from Madagascar to New Zealand. The story of Megalania is not just the story of a giant lizard. It is the story of first contact between our species and a world we had never seen before. A world where the predators were unlike anything in human memory or experience, where the rules of survival had to be reinvented from scratch, and where the decisions made by those first arrivals would permanently alter the entire living world of an ancient continent. The evolutionary forge. To understand Megalania, you first have to understand Australia. Not the Australia of today, the sunburned continent of eucalyptus forests and red desert and coastal cities. You have to understand the deep Australia, the Australia of 50 million years ago, when the continent was still drifting northward after its separation from Antarctica, when rainforests covered much of the interior, when the fauna was in the early stages of an evolutionary experiment that would produce some of the strangest animals in the history of vertebrate life. Because here is the fundamental truth about Australian evolution that makes everything else make sense. Australia is not just geographically isolated. It is evolutionarily isolated in a way that no other major landmass on Earth has been for the same duration. When the supercontinent of Gondwana began to fragment, Australia and Antarctica separated from the other landmasses roughly 85 million years ago. Australia then drifted away from Antarctica itself around 35 million years. And for the entirety of that long, slow drift northward, through the Eocene, through the Oligocene, through the Miocene and Pliocene, Australia's fauna evolved in almost complete isolation. No lions, no wolves, no bears, no hyenas, no large felid predators of any kind. What filled the apex predator niches in Australia were not placental mammals. They were marsupials, pouched mammals following their own evolutionary logic, and reptiles, specifically varanid reptiles. And that absence of competition is the single most important fact in Megalania's entire evolutionary story. The varanid lineage has ancient roots. The family Varanidae, the true monitor lizards, appears in the fossil record during the late Cretaceous, approximately 80 million years ago. The earliest members of this lineage were smaller animals, probably generalist predators in Asian ecosystems. But from the beginning, varanids displayed a set of characteristics that made them exceptional among lizards. They were, and are, among the most cognitively sophisticated reptiles alive. Studies by cognitive ethologist Anna Wilkins at the University of Melbourne and other researchers have demonstrated that monitor lizards show problem-solving abilities, individual recognition, and learning capacities that far exceed what we typically associate with reptilian intelligence. A Komodo dragon can learn to associate a specific keeper with food. It can navigate mazes. It can remember solutions to problems across extended time periods. This matters for understanding Megalania, because intelligence in a predator is not a luxury. It is a survival tool. It means more flexible hunting strategies. It means the ability to learn from failed hunts. It means, potentially, the ability to assess prey and adjust tactics accordingly. Varanids also have a respiratory system that is, in important ways, more efficient than that of most other. Research by biologist Cullum Brown and others has shown that varanids have a unidirectional airflow system in their lungs. Air flows in one direction rather than in and out through the same passages, which dramatically increases oxygen extraction efficiency. This gives them aerobic capacity that other lizards simply do not have. It is why a Komodo dragon can run at speeds of up to 19 kilometers per hour in short bursts. It is why varanids can sustain activity levels that would exhaust other reptiles of comparable size. Scale that physiology up to a 5, 6, or 7-meter animal, and you have something genuinely alarming. The varanid line reached Australia through a series of dispersal events that paleontologists are still working to reconstruct. The island-hopping route through what is now the Indonesian archipelago, a chain of islands and shallow seas that expanded and contracted with changing sea levels throughout the Miocene and Pliocene, provided intermittent connections between mainland Asia and Australia. The ancestor of the Australian varanid radiation likely arrived during the Miocene, perhaps 15 to 20 million years ago. Once established in Australia, this founding population began to diversify. Today, Australia is home to roughly 30 species of monitor lizard, the goannas, making it one of the most varanid-rich regions on Earth. This diversity is itself a testament to the evolutionary success of the lineage in the Australian environment. But one lineage went further than all the others. The fossil record of Varanus priscus, Megalania, extends back to at least the early Pleistocene, roughly 2 million years ago. The species, or a very close ancestor, was present in Australia during a period when the continent's climate was shifting, when grasslands were expanding, when the megafaunal community that would persist into the late Pleistocene was taking. What drove the size increase? This is where the science becomes genuinely fascinating, and where several competing explanations are still being debated. The first explanation is prey availability. Pleistocene Australia was home to an extraordinary array of large-bodied herbivores. Diprotodon optatum, the largest marsupial ever to have lived, was a wombat-like creature the size of a hippopotamus, weighing up to 2,700 kilograms. Procoptodon goliah was a short-faced kangaroo that stood roughly 2 meters tall and may have weighed 240 kilograms. Palorchestes azael, sometimes called the marsupial tapir, was a large, browsing marsupial with powerful forelimbs. Zygomaturus trilobus was another giant diprotodontid, adapted to wetland environments. These were large animals. Hunting them required a large predator. If varanid metabolism and physiology allowed for the evolution of a genuinely large body, and if the prey base rewarded larger body size with access to more calorie-dense kills, then natural selection would favor increasing body size over evolutionary time. This is a well-documented phenomenon in island and isolated continent evolution, sometimes called island gigantism, though in Australia's case, the mechanism operates on a continental scale. Without competition from large mammalian carnivores, the ecological space for a large apex predator was open, and a varanid lineage with the right physiological toolkit was positioned to fill it. The second explanation involves the thermal ecology of large reptiles. Larger reptiles retain heat more efficiently than smaller ones, a principle called gigantothermy. An animal the size of Megalania, even without mammalian-style endothermy, would have been far more thermally stable than a smaller lizard. In the seasonal climate of Pleistocene Australia, this could have been a significant advantage, allowing Megalania to remain active during cooler periods when smaller reptiles would have been sluggish. The third explanation, proposed by some researchers, involves the competitive landscape with marsupial carnivores. The thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, and Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, were formidable predators. But they were not large enough to consistently dominate the very largest prey items. Megalania, growing to its exceptional size, may have occupied an ecological niche that was simply inaccessible to mammalian carnivores constrained by marsupial reproductive biology and metabolic requirements. Now let us talk about how Megalania actually killed things. This is where the science has undergone a genuinely dramatic revision over the past 2 decades, and where the story of Megalania intersects with one of the most contentious debates in recent herpetology. For most of the 20th century, the conventional wisdom about Komodo dragons, and by extension, their giant relative Megalania, was that the primary killing mechanism was bacterial. The idea, popularized by Walter Offenberg's landmark 1981 study, The Behavioral Ecology of the Komodo Monitor, was that Komodo dragons harbored an extraordinary concentration of pathogenic bacteria in their mouths, the result of eating carrion and never cleaning their teeth, and that a bite from a Komodo dragon would introduce a lethal bacterial cocktail into the wound. The prey animal would escape the initial strike, stagger away, and die within days from septicemia. The Komodo would then follow the scent trail to the carcass and feed. It was a compelling. It was also, as Brian Fry of the University of Queensland and his colleagues demonstrated in a landmark 2009 paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, substantially wrong. Fry's team used magnetic resonance imaging to study the heads of Komodo dragons and discovered something that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Komodo dragons have venom glands. Specifically, they have mandibular glands that produce a venom containing anticoagulant compounds, substances that prevent blood from clotting. A bite from a Komodo dragon introduces these compounds into the wound, causing rapid blood pressure drops and preventing the normal clotting response that would otherwise seal the wound. The prey animal does not die from bacterial infection over several days. It dies from shock and blood loss, accelerated by a venom that keeps the wound bleeding freely. And Fry's research extended beyond Komodo dragons. His team examined the phylogenetic distribution of venom glands across varanids and concluded that venom production is ancestral to the entire varanid lineage, meaning that essentially all monitor lizards, including the smaller Australian goannas, likely produce some form of venom, including Megalania, a 7-meter varanid with anticoagulant venom, delivering that venom through serrated, recurved teeth into a deep bite wound, and then tracking the weakening prey animal by scent across kilometers of open scrubland. That is not a picture that requires any embellishment. The teeth of Megalania deserve particular attention because they tell us something important about hunting strategy. Varanid teeth are laterally compressed and recurved. They curve backward toward the throat. This design is extremely effective for gripping and tearing flesh, but it is not optimized for the bone-crushing bite of a hyena or the precision-killing bite of a big. What it is optimized for is causing maximum tissue damage and preventing prey from pulling free of the grip. When a large varanid bites, it does not simply puncture. It grips, and then it pulls, using the powerful muscles of its neck and the leverage of its entire body. The result is a tearing wound that is far larger than the initial bite. Combined with anticoagulant venom flooding into that wound, the effect on a large prey animal would be catastrophic blood loss, even if the initial strike missed any vital organs. Fossil teeth assigned to Megalania show the same recurved, serrated morphology seen in living varanids, scaled up to a size appropriate for an animal capable of tackling diprotodon-sized prey. Ralph Molnar's detailed analysis of Megalania dental material, published across several papers in the 1980s and 90s, established this morphological continuity clearly. There is one more aspect of Megalania's biology that we need to address before we can fully understand what early humans were facing when they arrived on this continent. How fast was it? The locomotion of large varanids has been studied extensively, and the results are both reassuring and deeply unsettling, depending on your perspective. Large monitor lizards use a distinctive locomotor pattern involving significant lateral undulation of the spine, a side-to-side sinuous movement that looks almost serpentine from above. This is not an inefficient form of locomotion. It actually allows varanids to achieve speeds that are surprising for their body size. A large adult Komodo dragon, an animal that can weigh 90 kilograms and reach 3 meters in length, can reach speeds of 19 kilometers per hour over short. Biomechanical modeling of Megalania, published by researchers including Paul Willis, then at the Queensland Museum, suggests that scaling these locomotor patterns up to a 5 or 6 meter animal would actually reduce top speed somewhat, due to the increased inertia of a much larger body. Estimates for Megalania's top speed range from about 14 to 17 kilometers per hour over short bursts. An average adult human runs at roughly 15 to 17 kilometers per hour. A fit, trained runner can exceed 20 kilometers per hour. So, yes, a healthy adult human in good condition, with warning and open ground, could potentially outrun Megalania. But now ask yourself a different question. What if you did not have warning? What if Megalania was not chasing you across open ground? What if it was doing what varanids do extraordinarily well? Lying in concealment, utterly still, body temperature regulated by the thermal mass of its enormous body, waiting with a patience that a cold-blooded ambush predator can maintain for hours. What if you were a child, an elderly person, someone already weakened by injury or illness? What if you were foraging in dense scrub, moving slowly, bent over examining plants, and you came within 3 meters of something that weighed 300 kilograms before you even knew it was there? The threat of Megalania to early humans was not necessarily the threat of a sustained, high-speed chase across open savanna. It was the threat of the ambush, the patient wait, the sudden, explosive strike from concealment that gave the prey almost no time to react. This is the predator that the first Australians walked into. Not a mythological monster, not a dragon from legend, though we will examine what legends may have remembered about it. A real animal, with real biology, occupying a real ecological niche at the top of a real food chain. An animal that had been refining its hunting strategies for millions of years before the first human footprint was pressed into the red soil of this ancient continent. An animal that had never encountered a primate before, had never encountered a tool-using, fire-wielding, socially coordinated group hunter before. And an animal that, when those first humans arrived, was about to meet a predator more dangerous than anything it had ever faced in its entire evolutionary history. The world before humans. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine it. Not the Australia you know, not the dry, sun-bleached landscape of red rock and sparse scrub that most people picture when they think of this continent. That Australia, the arid, desiccated Australia of today, is itself a relatively recent creation, shaped by the climate shifts of the last 20,000 years, and, crucially, by the ecological catastrophe that we are going to examine in detail before this video is done. The Australia of 50,000 years ago was different, profoundly, almost unrecognizably different. The interior of the continent, much of which is today the driest desert on Earth, supported permanent lakes and river systems. Lake Eyre, today the largest lake in Australia, which fills with water only rarely during exceptional flood years, was a permanent body of water in the Pleistocene, surrounded by grasslands and woodlands teeming with animal life. The Willandra Lake system in what is now western New South Wales held deep, permanent water, supporting fish populations, water birds, and the megafaunal grazers that came to drink at its shores. We know this not from speculation, but from direct evidence. The fossil beds of the Willandra Lakes region are among the richest Pleistocene deposits in the southern hemisphere, and they have yielded not only animal bones, but the oldest human remains ever found in Australia. The climate was cooler and wetter than today, though still highly seasonal. Rainfall patterns were different. Vegetation zones that today exist only in narrow coastal strips extended hundreds of kilometers into the interior. The continent was, by any measure, more productive, more biodiverse, and more capable of supporting large-bodied animal life than it is now. And the animal life it supported was extraordinary. Let us walk through this landscape together. Let us do what the first humans did when they arrived on these shores and looked inland. Let us try to make sense of a fauna unlike anything the rest of the world had produced. The largest animal in this ecosystem was Diprotodon optatum. Say that name slowly, Diprotodon. It deserves the weight of emphasis because this animal was genuinely one of the most remarkable large mammals to have existed anywhere on Earth during the Pleistocene. Diprotodon was a marsupial, a pouched mammal like a kangaroo or a wombat, carrying its young in a pouch. But where a modern wombat weighs perhaps 35 kilograms, Diprotodon weighed up to 2,700 kilograms. It stood roughly 1.5 meters at the shoulder and was perhaps 3 meters in length. Its skull alone was 60 centimeters long. It was, in the most literal sense, a wombat the size of a rhinoceros. Diprotodon was a grazer and browser, moving in what paleontologists believe were large herds across the open woodlands and grasslands of Pleistocene Australia. Isotopic analysis of Diprotodon teeth, conducted by researchers including Gilbert Price at the University of Queensland, suggests that these animals undertook seasonal migrations, moving hundreds of kilometers between wet season and dry season ranges, following the pulse of rainfall and fresh vegetation across the landscape. Vast, slow-moving herds of 2-ton marsupials migrating across a continent. Think about what that means for a predator with the sensory range and patient hunting style of Megalania. The prey came to you. Every year, reliably, the herds moved along the same corridors, paused at the same water sources, concentrated in the same seasonal feeding grounds. For millions of years, this was the rhythm of the Australian Pleistocene. But Diprotodon was only the beginning. Procoptodon goliath, the giant short-faced kangaroo, was a browser rather than a grazer, using its powerful forelimbs to pull down branches that smaller kangaroos could not reach. Standing nearly 2.5 meters tall, it was the largest kangaroo ever to have lived. Its feet had a single functional toe on each foot, an adaptation that gave it remarkable speed and efficiency on open ground, not unlike the evolutionary logic that produced the single-toed horse in the Northern Hemisphere. Palorchestes azale was stranger still. Sometimes called the marsupial tapir, it had powerful clawed forelimbs, possibly prehensile in function, used to pull vegetation, and a probable proboscis, a short trunk-like nose that would have helped it gather food. Reconstructions of Palorchestes look almost surreal, like something a paleontologist might sketch in a fever dream, and yet the fossil evidence for its anatomy is solid. Zygomaturus trilobus was a smaller relative of Diprotodon, adapted to wetland environments, with shovel-like lower incisors, possibly used to dig up aquatic vegetation. It was the ecological equivalent of a hippo, a large, semi-aquatic herbivore dominating riverine and lake margin habitats. And then there were the birds. Guineornis newtoni was a giant flightless bird, a maihirung in the language of some Aboriginal groups, standing nearly 2 meters tall and weighing perhaps 230 kilograms. It was not a runner in the mold of an ostrich or an emu. Its legs were proportionally shorter, its body more massive. It was built more like a cassowary, scaled up dramatically. A heavily built bird with powerful legs and almost certainly a formidable beak. Researchers Gifford Miller and John McGee of the University of Colorado, studying isotopic signatures in Guineornis eggshell fragments from archaeological sites, published a landmark paper in 2016 in the journal Nature Communications, suggesting that burned Guineornis eggshells at multiple Australian sites showed chemical signatures consistent with human-set fires rather than natural wildfire. It was one of the first direct lines of evidence suggesting that early Australians were actively interacting with, and possibly hunting, the megafauna shortly after arrival. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We will return to the extinction question. Right now, we need to understand what the first humans walked into. The predator community of Pleistocene Australia was, in its own way, as remarkable as the prey community. Thylacyleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, was perhaps the most biomechanically efficient predator of its size to have evolved anywhere during the Cenozoic. Despite being a marsupial, despite having a body plan that evolved entirely independently from placental carnivores, Thylacoleo converged on a killing strategy of extraordinary effectiveness. Its skull was short and deep, optimized for generating massive bite force relative to skull size. Paleontologist Stephen Rowe, in a 2005 paper in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, calculated that Thylacoleo had the highest bite force quotient, bite force relative to body weight, of any known mammalian carnivore, living or extinct. Higher than a spotted hyena, higher than a tiger, higher, pound for pound, than any placental. Its forelimbs were powerful and heavily muscled, with semi-retractile claws, a feature almost unheard of in marsupials, that allowed it to grip and restrain prey. Its lower incisors formed a pair of procumbent stabbing teeth. Its carnassials, the shearing cheek teeth, were so enlarged that they had essentially replaced all other cheek teeth, giving it a dentition devoted almost entirely to slicing flesh and crushing bone. Thylacoleo was probably an ambush predator, waiting in trees and dropping onto prey passing beneath, a killing strategy reconstructed partly from the morphology of its grasping forelimbs and partly from trackway evidence found in a limestone cave system at Tight Entrance Cave in Western Australia, studied by researcher Gavin Prideaux. At roughly 100 to 160 kilograms, Thylacoleo was not in the same size class as Megalania, but it was formidable enough that the first humans arriving in Australia would have had very good reason to be cautious around dense scrub and overhanging branches. And then there was the thylacine. Thylacinus cynocephalus, the Tasmanian tiger, or marsupial wolf, was present on mainland Australia throughout the Pleistocene. The animal that survived into historical times in Tasmania and was hunted to extinction by European settlers in the 20th century, the last captive individual dying in Hobart Zoo on the 7th of September 1936, was only the remnant of a much more widespread species. On the Pleistocene mainland, the thylacine occupied the ecological niche of a cursorial pursuit predator, an animal that ran prey down over distance. Its jaws could open to an extraordinary angle, nearly 90 degrees, giving it a gape that was disproportionate to its skull size. Though not as powerfully built as Thylacoleo, the thylacine was probably a more versatile predator, capable of taking a wider range of prey sizes and hunting in more open terrain. The coexistence of Thylacoleo, the thylacine, and Megalania in the same ecosystem raises fascinating questions about how these three very different predators partitioned their resources. Did Megalania dominate at carcasses, driving the marsupial carnivores away from kills? Did the marsupials avoid direct competition with the giant lizard by focusing on different prey sizes or different habitat types? Were there direct confrontations? We have no direct fossil evidence of predator-predator interactions in the Australian Pleistocene, but the ecological logic suggests that these animals must have been aware of each other, must have had evolved responses to each other's presence, must have shaped each other's behavior over millions of years of coexistence. There is one more predator in this community that deserves mention, because it occupied a completely different ecological niche and demonstrates just how thoroughly the reptilian lineages had exploited the Australian environment. Wanambi neracortensis was a giant constricting snake, a member of the family Madsoidae, an ancient lineage of snakes that had been present in Australia since the Cretaceous. Wanambi reached lengths of perhaps 5 to 6 meters and was probably a specialist ambush predator at water sources, coiled in concealment near the edges of lakes and rivers, waiting for animals that came to drink. The Madsoid snakes, Wanambi and its relatives, represented yet another ancient lineage that had found ecological success in the isolated Australian environment, persisting long after their relatives had disappeared from the rest of the world. Imagine being one of the first humans to approach a waterhole in Pleistocene Australia. The water is there. You are thirsty after days of travel. But the grass around the water's edge is dense, the reeds are tall. Somewhere in that dense vegetation, something might be watching. A giant constricting snake, a Megalania, a Thylacoleo in the overhanging tree. Every approach to water was a risk assessment. Every movement through dense scrub required vigilance that modern humans, living in sanitized urban environments, can barely imagine. Now I want to draw your attention to something that is easy to miss when we catalog these extraordinary animals one by one. This was a stable ecosystem. For millions of years, through climate shifts, through the expansion and contraction of ice sheets, through the drying and refilling of interior lakes, this community of giant herbivores and formidable predators had maintained a dynamic equilibrium. Populations fluctuated. Species ranges shifted. Some animals evolved new forms, while ancestral lineages went extinct. But the fundamental structure, large herbivores, apex reptilian and marsupial predators, a diverse community of smaller animals filling every available niche, had persisted. This stability is important because it tells us something about the resilience of the system. This was not a fragile ecosystem teetering on the edge of collapse. This was a mature, deeply integrated ecological community with millions of years of coevolution behind it. The prey animals had evolved responses to their predators. The predators had evolved their hunting strategies in response to prey behavior. The vegetation had evolved in response to the grazing and browsing pressure of the megafauna. Everything was connected. Everything was in balance. And then, sometime between 65,000 and 50,000 years ago, something arrived that this ecosystem had never encountered before. Something that did not fit into any of the established ecological categories. Something that was neither a marsupial, nor a reptile, nor a bird. Something small, bipedal, relatively slow, with no natural weapons worth mentioning, no claws, no venom, no crushing bite force, no great speed. But something that carried, in its hands and in its social networks, and in the extraordinary computational power of its 3-pound brain, tools and strategies and accumulated knowledge that made it the most dangerous thing that had ever set foot on this continent. The first Australians had arrived. And the ancient world of Megalania, the world that had been stable for millions of years, was about to change forever. The crossing. Let us stop for a moment and appreciate what the first Australians actually achieved. Because we have a tendency, when we talk about prehistoric migration, to reduce it to an abstraction, a dotted line on a map, an arrow pointing from Southeast Asia toward Australia, labeled First Migration, approximately 65,000 years ago. Clean, simple, almost mundane. It was none of those things. The crossing from Southeast Asia to Australia, even at the height of the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were significantly lower than today, and exposed land bridges connected many of the islands of the Indonesian archipelago, required open ocean voyaging of at least 90 kilometers, and possibly considerably more, depending on the exact route taken. 90 kilometers of open water. No land visible at the departure point. No guarantee of land at the destination. No GPS, no compass, no charts, no knowledge passed down from previous generations who had made this journey, because no previous generation had ever made it. This was not a crossing that happened by accident. It was not a group of people clinging to a log after a flood, drifting passively until they happened to wash up on an unknown. The archaeological and genetic evidence is unambiguous on this point. The founding population of Australia was large enough, estimates range from several hundred to several thousand individuals, to establish a viable breeding population. You do not get that from accidental drift. You get that from intentional, organized, repeated crossings. These people built watercraft. They planned the journey. They coordinated the movement of enough individuals to populate a continent. And they did it 65,000 years ago. The genetic evidence for this migration has been refined dramatically over the past 2 decades. Studies of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome markers in contemporary Aboriginal Australian populations, combined with ancient DNA analysis of skeletal remains, have established a clear picture of a single founding migration event, or possibly a small number of closely spaced events, from a source population somewhere in South or Southeast Asia. Work by researchers including Eske Villerslev of the University of Copenhagen, whose team published a landmark whole genome analysis of Aboriginal Australians in the journal Nature in 2016, established that Aboriginal Australians descend from the first humans to migrate out of Africa, who did not subsequently return. They represent the oldest continuous population outside Africa, a lineage that has been in Australia for the entire duration of human presence on that continent. 50,000 years. 65,000 years. The exact number remains debated. But by any measure, this is the longest unbroken human occupation of any landmass outside Africa. The culture, the knowledge systems, the oral traditions, and the spiritual frameworks of Aboriginal Australians are not merely old by the standards of world civilization. They are old by the standards of human prehistory itself. The question of what those first arrivals encountered and how they survived it is therefore not merely an academic curiosity. It is a question about the deepest roots of the oldest living human cultures on Earth. The route of the migration is itself a matter of ongoing scholarly debate, with 2 primary candidates proposed by researchers. The northern route would have taken migrants through the Philippines and along the chain of islands that today forms eastern Indonesia, Sulawesi, the Maluku Islands, and then across the final open ocean gap to the northern coast of New Guinea, from which Australia's Cape York Peninsula was accessible via a land bridge or a short crossing. The southern route would have gone through Sumatra and Java, connected to mainland Asia by land bridges during periods of low sea level, and then island-hopped through what is now Nusa Tenggara, the chain of islands including Bali, Lombok, Sumbawa, Flores, and Timor, before the final crossing to northwestern Australia. Both routes required open ocean crossings that would have been genuinely hazardous. The waters between Bali and Lombok, for example, a relatively narrow strait even today, mark the so-called Wallace Line, the biogeographic boundary identified by 19th century naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, beyond which the fauna changes dramatically from Asian to Australian types. This line exists precisely because it represents a water barrier that has been deep enough for long enough to prevent most land animals from crossing even during periods of low sea level. The people who crossed it were doing something that no land animal had managed on its own. Researcher Adam Brum of Griffith University and his colleagues, working at sites on the island of Sulawesi, have documented cave art dating to at least 45,000 years ago, figurative paintings of animals that represent some of the oldest known art anywhere in the world. This tells us that the people making the crossing to Australia were not primitive, cognitively limited hominins. They were modern humans in every meaningful sense. People who created art, who had symbolic thought, who lived in socially complex communities with rich cultural traditions. They were, in short, people like us. Now let us think carefully about what these people knew and what they did not know as they made that final crossing. They knew, presumably, that land lay somewhere beyond the horizon to the south and east. Perhaps they had seen smoke from distant fires. Perhaps they had observed the flight patterns of birds. Perhaps they had encountered debris, vegetation, floating carcasses, unfamiliar insects that suggested a large landmass beyond the visible ocean. The peoples of the Pacific and Southeast Asian islands were, and are, extraordinarily sophisticated readers of ocean signs. The techniques of open ocean wayfinding using stars, wave patterns, bird behavior, and cloud formations that are documented among Pacific Island navigators today almost certainly have ancient roots. But what they could not have known was what waited for them on the other side. They had evolved in Africa and migrated through Asia in environments where the large predators were lions, leopards, tigers, hyenas, placental mammals that shared a common evolutionary heritage with the prey animals, including humans, that they hunted. The human lineage had co-evolved with these predators over millions of years. We had evolved fear responses calibrated to their threat signatures. We had developed hunting and defensive strategies refined through countless generations of direct experience. None of that experience was relevant in Australia. The predators here moved differently. They smelled different. They behaved differently. A Megalania did not stalk like a lion. It did not hunt in coordinated groups like hyenas. It did not announce its presence with a roar. It was quiet, cold, patient. And when it struck with a speed and explosive force that its massive body gave no obvious warning of. The first humans in Australia had to learn this continent from scratch. Had to learn which animals were dangerous and which were not, which plants were edible, where the water was, how the seasonal patterns worked, which sounds in the night were harmless, and which sounds should send you reaching for your spear. That learning process was not free. It had a cost, and some of that cost was paid in blood. The archaeological record of the earliest human presence in Australia is frustratingly sparse, as the record of any human activity from 50 to 65,000 years ago inevitably is. But what we have is remarkable. The Medjedbebe rock shelter, located in the Mirarr country of the Northern Territory, near the western edge of Arnhem Land, has been excavated multiple times, most recently in a comprehensive program led by Chris Clarkson and colleagues, with results published in Nature in 2017. The site yielded stone tools, including ground-edge axes, the oldest known in the world, ochre, reflective fragments used possibly as mirrors or ornaments, and plant processing equipment. The dates obtained from this excavation, using optically stimulated luminescence dating of sediments, suggested human occupation beginning between 65,000 and 80,000 years ago. numbers that pushed the accepted timeline of Australian colonization significantly earlier than previous estimates and generated considerable scholarly debate. The more conservative mainstream estimate, based on a synthesis of multiple dated sites, places the first human arrival at around 50,000 to 65,000 years ago. But even at the conservative end of this range, the implications for coexistence with Megalania are significant. If Megalania persisted until approximately 40,000 years ago, the date suggested by the most recent uranium series dating of fossil material, then the two species overlapped on this continent for at minimum 10,000 years, and possibly for 25,000 years or more. 10,000 years. Think about what that means in human terms. 10,000 years ago, the last ice age was ending. Agriculture had not yet been invented anywhere on Earth. The pyramids of Giza were 7,000 years in the future. 10,000 years of shared landscape. 10,000 years of potential encounters, conflicts, adaptations, and, possibly, embedded memories. There is a body of research, controversial but genuinely thought-provoking, that suggests the memories of megafauna encounters may have persisted in Aboriginal oral traditions far longer than most Western scholars initially believed. Researcher Patrick Nunn of the University of the Sunshine Coast, who has spent years documenting the geological accuracy of Aboriginal oral traditions, including stories that accurately describe sea level changes and the flooding of coastal landscapes that occurred between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago, has argued that oral traditions in many cultures can preserve accurate environmental information across extraordinarily long timescales. If that is true of geological events, coastlines drowning, volcanoes erupting, islands appearing and disappearing, it may also be true of biological encounters, of memories of animals that no longer exist. Several researchers, including paleontologist Paul Willis, have noted that Aboriginal traditions in various regions include descriptions of large, lizard-like creatures with characteristics that do not match any living Australian reptile. The bunyip, a much-discussed figure in Aboriginal tradition, is most often associated with large aquatic animals, but some regional variants describe something more reptilian, more terrestrial, more consistent with a giant goanna. The Queensland Aboriginal tradition of the Karkamara, a giant goanna said to have existed in the deep past, has attracted particular attention. Stories of enormous lizards that could take adult humans as prey, told across multiple language groups in different parts of the continent, could represent purely mythological constructions, or they could represent, as Nunn and others suggest, a deep cultural memory of an animal that was real. This remains speculative, clearly marked as such. The scientific standards required to establish that a specific oral tradition encodes memory of a specific extinct animal are extremely high, and those standards have not been met definitively for any Megalania-related tradition. But the possibility is real, and it raises one of the most extraordinary questions in the entire story of human prehistory. Did the people who painted the first art in the caves of Australia, the same people, or the direct cultural descendants of the people who crossed the ocean to reach this continent, did they paint Megalania? Did they tell stories about it around fires? Did they warn their children about the giant ripper lizard that lay in wait in the long grass near the waterhole? Did the oldest human culture on Earth carry, in its oldest stories, the memory of the largest land predator of the Cenozoic? We cannot answer that question with certainty. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But we can do the next best thing. We can reconstruct, as carefully and as honestly as the evidence allows, what those first encounters may have looked like, what the threat actually was, how humans and Megalania may have interacted across those thousands of years of shared land. And we can ask the question that haunts the entire second half of this story. When Megalania finally disappeared from the Australian continent, when the last individual of this extraordinary species died, somewhere in the ancient landscape, sometime around 40,000 years ago, what killed it? Was it the changing climate? The drying of the interior lakes? The contraction of the prey base? Or was it the small, clever, fire-wielding bipeds who had arrived from across the sea, and who, over the course of thousands of years, had learned exactly how to hunt the giant ripper lizard? That question is waiting for us. But first, we need to understand what a confrontation between early humans and Megalania actually looked like, what the tactical reality was, who had the advantages, and who had the vulnerabilities. We need to understand the hunt. Face to face. Let us reconstruct a moment. Not a documented moment. Not a moment preserved in any chronicle or inscription or written record, because no writing existed anywhere on Earth when this happened. But a moment that, given everything we know about the ecology, the behavior, and the geography of Pleistocene Australia, was almost certainly real. A moment that happened, in one form or another, thousands of times across 10,000 years of coexistence. A small group of people, perhaps 8 or 10 individuals, a family unit or a band of related families, is moving through open woodland in what is today Western Queensland. The time is early morning. The sun has been up for perhaps 2 hours, and the air still holds the cool of the night. The group is following a dry creek bed, moving toward a permanent waterhole that lies perhaps 3 kilometers ahead. They know this landscape. They have traveled this route before in previous seasons. The waterhole is reliable. It draws game. It is worth the journey. The group moves quietly. The adults carry wooden spears, fire-hardened, carefully shaped, the product of hours of skilled work. 2 of the adults carry digging sticks, useful for extracting tubers and also, in a pinch, as weapons. The older children move with the adults, already learning the pattern of eyes and ears vigilance that will define their entire lives. The youngest children are carried. Nobody is talking. Not because of any formal rule of silence, but because this is how you move through the country where large predators exist. You listen. You watch. You read the landscape. And then one of the adults stops. In the dry creek bed ahead, perhaps 40 meters away, something has disturbed the sand. A long, wide furrow, flanked by the deep, widely spaced impressions of clawed feet. A drag mark running alongside the footprints, something heavy being carried or dragged. The smell of blood, faint but unmistakable, carried on the morning air. Megalania passed through this creek bed within the last few hours. The question is, which direction did it go? This is the reality of coexistence with a large apex predator. It is not a constant state of terror. No human community could function in a state of constant terror, and the evidence from modern communities living alongside large predators like lions, leopards, and crocodiles shows that people develop sophisticated, largely successful strategies for managing the risk. But it is a state of constant awareness, a background hum of vigilance that shapes every decision about where to travel, when to travel, where to camp, where to collect water, where to let children play. The cognitive load of that vigilance is enormous, and over generations, it produces something remarkable, an accumulated body of knowledge about predator behavior that is extraordinarily detailed, extraordinarily accurate, and extraordinarily practical. Modern Aboriginal tracking knowledge, documented by researchers including David Trigger of the University of Queensland and anthropologist Deborah Bird-Rose, is among the most sophisticated environmental knowledge systems ever studied. The ability to read landscape signs, footprints, disturbed vegetation, the behavior of birds that mob predators, the particular silence that falls over an area when a large carnivore is present, represents thousands of years of accumulated observation, tested against reality, refined through experience, and passed down through cultural transmission. That knowledge did not appear fully formed. It was built, painfully, incrementally, across generations. And in the earliest period of Australian occupation, before that knowledge base existed, before the cultural transmission networks had been established, before the landscape was known and its dangers mapped, in that earliest period, the cost of ignorance was real. So what were the specific challenges that Megalania posed to early humans? Let us think through this systematically, the way a genuine threat assessment would require. The first challenge was detection. Modern Komodo dragons are remarkably difficult to detect in their natural habitat, despite being animals that can exceed 3 meters in length and weigh 90 kilograms. Their coloration, gray-brown, mottled, variable, provides excellent camouflage in the dappled light and shadow environments of scrub and open woodland. They move with a slow, deliberate economy that produces very little sound or disturbance when they are not actively running. And critically, they are capable of remaining completely motionless for extended periods, hours if necessary, while waiting. Scale that up to a 5 or 6 meter animal in the denser vegetation of Pleistocene Australia, in a landscape where the concept of giant lizard did not exist in the cultural knowledge of the arriving humans, and detection becomes a genuine problem. Research by wildlife biologist Tim Jessup, who has conducted extensive fieldwork on Komodo dragon detection and behavior in Komodo National Park, has documented cases where adult dragons remained undetected by experienced researchers at distances of less than 10 meters. Experienced researchers. People who knew what they were looking for. The first Australians did not know what they were looking for. The second challenge was the nature of the attack itself. A Megalania attack would have been explosive, brief, and extremely violent. The initial strike, driven by the powerful musculature of the neck and forelimbs, delivered with serrated, recurved teeth, and almost certainly accompanied by the injection of anticoagulant venom, would have caused immediate, severe trauma. Deep lacerations, torn muscle and connective tissue, rapid, uncontrolled bleeding. If the initial strike was directed at the legs, the most accessible target for an animal attacking from ground level, the result would be immediate incapacitation. If directed at the torso or neck, it could be immediately fatal. The grip and tear behavior documented in large varanids means that even a partial strike, even if the human managed to pull partially free, would result in massive wound trauma. The recurved teeth do not release cleanly. Pulling away from a varanid bite makes the wound larger, not smaller. And then there is the venom. The anticoagulant compounds documented by Brian Fry's research in Komodo dragons, if present in Megalania, as the phylogenetic evidence strongly suggests, would have made wound management essentially impossible with the medical resources available to Pleistocene hunter-gatherers. Wounds that would normally clot and begin healing would continue to bleed freely. Deep muscle wounds that might otherwise be survivable would become progressively more dangerous as blood loss continued. A human who survived the initial attack but was not immediately rescued and treated would face a slow, agonizing death from blood loss and infection over the following hours or days. The third challenge was the size differential. An adult Megalania at 300 kilograms had a mass advantage of roughly 4 to 1 over an adult human. This is not an insurmountable disadvantage in a coordinated group attack with weapons. Lions weighing 220 kilograms are successfully hunted by Maasai warriors using spears, and have been for centuries. But it requires coordination, courage, and very specific tactical knowledge about where to strike and how to manage the animal's responses. That tactical knowledge, for Megalania, had to be developed from scratch. There was no cultural memory of how to hunt a giant lizard. There was no elder who had faced Megalania before and survived, and could teach the young hunters what to do. In the earliest period of Australian occupation, every encounter with Megalania was, in a sense, a first encounter. Every group that faced this animal had to work out its vulnerabilities through direct, dangerous experimentation. Some of those experiments will have failed. But here is what is crucial to understand, and what makes the human side of this story so remarkable. Humans are not passive victims. We are not prey animals in any simple sense. We are, in fact, among the most dangerous large animals on Earth. Not because of our physical attributes, but because of our cognitive flexibility, our social coordination, and our capacity to develop and transmit technology. The spear, in the hands of a skilled thrower, is a remarkable weapon. Experimental archaeology studies, including work by physical anthropologist Kai Zeddy at the University of Utrecht, examining the penetration capacity of replica Paleolithic spears, have demonstrated that a fire-hardened wooden spear thrown by a trained adult male can penetrate the hide of large animals with sufficient force to cause serious internal injury. The effective range of a skilled spear thrower is perhaps 15 to 20 meters, far enough to allow an attack before a Megalania could close to bite range. Fire is even more significant. Every large predator studied in modern wildlife research shows a strong aversion response to open flame. Lions, leopards, tigers, all of them can be deterred from camp approaches by fire. The reason is evolutionary. Fire is an extremely rare event in most natural environments. It is unpredictable, it spreads, and it causes serious injury. Any predator lineage that did not develop a healthy aversion to fire would quickly be selected against. Megalania almost certainly had never encountered deliberately wielded fire before the first humans arrived. Its aversion response to fire, if it had one, would have been calibrated to the natural wildfires that periodically swept the Australian landscape, distant things, large-scale things, things you moved away from slowly as part of a general landscape-level response. It would not have been calibrated to a small, controlled fire carried by a group of bipeds and thrust toward its face. The first time an early Australian thrust a burning branch at an approaching Megalania, the animal's response was probably confusion, then perhaps retreat. And if it happened again, and again, if enough individuals in a population of Megalania had sufficient negative experiences with fire-carrying humans, the behavioral ecology of the entire species may have begun to shift. Let us also consider the social dimension of early human defensive. Modern hunter-gatherer communities living in leopard and lion country do not face large predators as isolated individuals. They face them as coordinated social groups. Warning calls, alarm systems, the rapid assembly of multiple armed adults, noise-making to deter approach, These are standard components of the anti-predator behavioral repertoire in every documented hunter-gatherer society that lives alongside dangerous carnivores. An organized group of 8 to 10 adults, armed with spears, making noise, carrying fire, and coordinating their movements, presents a very different threat profile than an isolated individual. The challenge, in the earliest period of Australian occupation, was that these social defensive systems had to be calibrated to a new set of predators with unfamiliar behaviors. The warning call that alerted your group to an approaching lion was based on the specific visual and auditory signatures of a lion. The warning call for Megalania, the particular pattern of disturbance in the grass, the specific smell, the particular silence that fell over the birds, had to be learned. That learning happened. It always does when humans occupy a new environment and survive. The question is what it cost in the learning. There is one more dimension to the human-Megalania relationship that deserves serious consideration, and it is a dimension that is often overlooked in discussions that focus exclusively on the predation threat. Megalania was also prey. Not easy prey, not safe prey, but prey nonetheless. A 300-kilogram animal represents an extraordinary quantity of food, enough protein and fat to feed a group of 10 people for several days. And unlike a diprotodon, which was massive but probably relatively fast-moving and capable of inflicting serious injury with its bulk, a dead or badly injured Megalania was a manageable proposition for a coordinated human group. The question of whether early Australians actively hunted Megalania, whether they developed specific strategies for killing the giant lizard rather than merely avoiding it, is one that cannot be answered definitively from the current fossil record. No Megalania bones have been found in clear association with human butchery marks or hearths in a context that unambiguously indicates hunting rather than scavenging. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The Australian Pleistocene fossil record is, as we have discussed, fragmentary and incomplete. The preservation conditions that would allow butchery marks to survive 50,000 years on reptile bone are demanding. The sites where such evidence might exist may not yet have been found, or may have been destroyed by subsequent geological processes. And the ecological logic is compelling. Humans hunt large, dangerous prey. We always have. The same cultural traditions that document extraordinary knowledge of landscape and animal behavior also document traditions of hunting the most dangerous animals in the environment, not despite the danger, but sometimes because of it. The prestige, the resources, and the practical benefit of removing a dangerous predator from your immediate landscape all create incentives for exactly this kind of high-risk, high-reward hunting. Here is what I want you to hold in your mind as we move forward into the final chapters of this story. For 10,000 years, or 20,000 years, or perhaps even longer, two of the most remarkable species in the history of life on Earth shared this continent. A giant, ancient reptile at the apex of an ecosystem that had been stable for millions of years, and a small, cognitively extraordinary primate that had just arrived from across the ocean, carrying fire and spears and accumulated knowledge and the astonishing human capacity to learn, adapt, and survive. Neither species was simple. Neither was merely a predator or merely a prey animal. Both were intelligent, flexible, ecologically complex organisms navigating a shared landscape. And the outcome of that 10,000-year encounter, the question of who ultimately shaped whom and at what cost, is the question we are going to answer next. Because one of these species is gone, and one of them is still here. The Great Dying. 40,000 years ago, something went terribly wrong in Australia. Not suddenly. Not in a single catastrophic event that left a clear, unambiguous signature in the geological record for future scientists to find and interpret. But across a span of centuries and millennia, one by one, species by species, the great animals of Pleistocene Australia began to disappear. Diprotodon optatum, gone. The giant wombat that had grazed the interior grasslands for millions of years, whose herds had shaped the vegetation of an entire continent, gone. Procoptodon gallia, gone. The 2.5-meter kangaroo that had browsed the treetops of ancient woodlands, gone. Thylacoleo carnifex, gone. The marsupial lion with the most powerful bite force of any mammalian carnivore, gone. Guineornis newtoni, gone. The giant mihirung bird, whose eggshells now lie burned in ancient hearths, gone. Wonambi neracortensis, gone. Zygomaturus, gone. Palorchestes, gone. And Megalania, gone. The Australian megafauna extinction was one of the most dramatic biological events of the late Pleistocene. Of the megafauna species, defined as animals weighing more than 44 kilograms, that existed in Australia before human arrival, approximately 90% were extinct by 30,000 years ago. 90% in a geological eye blink. An ecosystem that had been stable for millions of years was dismantled within what amounts, in deep time terms, to a historical moment. The question of why has been generating fierce scientific debate for more than half. And it is a debate that matters far beyond Australia. Because what happened here, or some version of what happened here, appears to have happened on every continent and major island group that humans colonized for the first time during the late Pleistocene and Holocene. The Americas, Madagascar, New Zealand, the Caribbean islands, the Pacific islands. Wherever modern humans arrived in force, the large animals died. Every single time. The debate over the Australian megafauna extinction has three main camps, and the differences between them are not merely academic. They reflect fundamentally different views of the relationship between human beings and the natural world, and they have real implications for how we understand conservation, ecological collapse, and the long-term impact of our species on the planet. The first camp argues for what is called the overkill hypothesis, the idea that human hunting was the primary or sole driver of megafauna extinction. This position was most forcefully articulated by American ecologist Paul Martin, who beginning in the 1960s developed what he called the blitzkrieg model of megafauna extinction. Martin's argument was elegantly simple. Megafauna extinctions correlate globally with the arrival of modern humans. They do not correlate with any specific climatic event. Therefore, humans killed them. In the Australian context, the overkill hypothesis has been championed by researchers including Richard Roberts of the University of Wollongong and Tim Flannery, whose popular book The Future Eaters, published in 1994, brought the debate to a wide public audience. Flannery argued that Aboriginal Australians, arriving on a continent whose megafauna had no experience of human hunters, and therefore no evolved fear response to humans, were able to hunt these animals to extinction with relative ease, what ecologists call a naive prey effect. The logic is compelling. Animals that have co-evolved with human hunters over long periods develop behavioral responses, flight distances, habitat selection, group defensive behaviors, calibrated to the specific threat profile of human hunting. Animals that have never encountered humans have none of these calibrations. A diprotodon that has never seen a human being has no reason to flee from one. It might simply stand and watch, with the calm indifference of an animal that has no learned fear, as a group of hunters positions itself for a coordinated spear attack. For Megalania, the naive prey argument cuts in an interesting direction. A giant predatory lizard might have had less to fear from early human hunters than a large herbivore. Its size and offensive capabilities gave it genuine advantages in any direct confrontation. But it was also vulnerable to the same fundamental problem. It had no evolved behavioral response to the specific threat profile of coordinated human hunters using projectile weapons and fire. The second camp argues for a climatic explanation. This position holds that the Australian megafauna was already under severe stress from long-term climate change, specifically the progressive aridification of the continent that intensified during the last glacial maximum, roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, and that human hunting, if it played any role at all, was a minor contributing factor that delivered a final blow to populations already in steep decline. The climatic argument has been advanced by researchers including Judith Field of the University of New South Wales and, in a more nuanced form, by Rainer Grün of the Australian National University, whose dating work on megafauna fossils has been central to reconstructing the timeline of extinctions. The climatic camp points to several lines. First, Australia had experienced previous glacial cycles, periods of cooling and aridification that were, in some cases, more severe than the last glacial maximum, without experiencing megafauna extinctions of comparable magnitude. If climate was sufficient to drive extinction, why did it not do so during earlier, equally severe climatic episodes? The climatic advocates have responses to this challenge, but they are complex and contested. They argue that the cumulative effect of multiple climatic cycles progressively degraded the resilience of megafauna populations, making them more vulnerable to each successive climatic stress event. They argue that the specific character of the last glacial maximum aridification was qualitatively different from previous cycles in ways that were particularly damaging to the megafauna. These arguments are not without merit. Climate change was real. The Australian interior did become dramatically more arid. Lake systems that had supported large herbivore populations did dry up. Vegetation communities did shift in ways that would have reduced the carrying capacity of the landscape for large-bodied grazers and browsers. But the timing problem remains. The extinctions, in most cases, appear to precede the most severe phase of last glacial maximum aridification by thousands of years. Diprotodon, for example, appears to have been extinct by roughly 46,000 years ago at most sites, well before the glacial maximum, and within a few thousand years of the best estimates for human arrival. The third camp, now arguably the majority position among Australian quaternary researchers, though the debate remains genuinely open, argues for a synergistic model. Humans and climate change worked together, in different ways and at different times, to produce an extinction event that neither factor alone would have caused. This position, articulated most comprehensively by researchers including Stephen Rowe and Judith Field in a significant 2006 paper in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, holds that human arrival added a novel stressor, direct hunting pressure, habitat modification through fire, disruption of behavioral patterns, to populations that were already experiencing the chronic stress of long-term climatic change. The combination was lethal in a way that neither factor alone would have been. This synergistic model has the virtue of explaining several otherwise puzzling features of the extinction record. It explains why previous climatic cycles did not cause comparable extinctions, because humans were not present during those cycles. It explains why human arrival on other continents produced similar, though not identical, extinction patterns. Because the relative contributions of hunting pressure and climatic stress varied in different regions and at different times. And it accommodates the genuine complexity of the fossil and sediment record, which does not tell a clean, simple story of either pure overkill or pure climate causation. Now let us focus specifically on Megalania within this broader extinction context. Megalania presents some unique challenges for the standard extinction narratives, because it was not simply a large herbivore vulnerable to overhunting. It was an apex predator. And apex predators respond to ecosystem disruption in distinctive ways. The most important factor for any apex predator is prey availability. Megalania's primary prey, the giant herbivores of Pleistocene Australia, were themselves going extinct. As diprotodon populations declined, as the giant kangaroo herds thinned, as the megafaunal community that had supported Megalania for millions of years began to unravel, the food base that supported a population of giant lizards. This is what ecologists call a trophic cascade, a wave of ecological disruption that propagates through a food web when a key component is removed or reduced. When large herbivore populations collapse, the apex predators that depend on them follow. They cannot simply switch prey indefinitely. There are energetic constraints. A 300-kilogram reptile requires a substantial caloric intake to maintain body condition and reproductive capacity. If the prey animals that provided that caloric intake are gone, the predator goes too. Researcher Frederick Saltre of Flinders University, whose team published a sophisticated modeling analysis of Australian megafauna extinction dynamics in 2019 in the journal Nature Communications, concluded that even very low levels of human hunting pressure, as few as 1 or 2 animals killed per person per decade across a slowly expanding human population, could have been sufficient to drive megafauna populations to extinction over timescales of thousands of years. This is not blitzkrieg. This is slow attrition. Chronic low-level pressure, sustained across millennia, tipping populations that were already stressed by climatic change over the edge into irreversible decline. For Megalania, the calculation is somewhat different, because it was not being directly hunted, at least not necessarily. But the indirect effect of human hunting on its prey base would have been sufficient to undermine its population over time. And there may have been direct hunting as well. As we discussed in the previous chapter, the incentives for removing a dangerous apex predator from your immediate landscape are real. A human community that had learned to hunt Megalania effectively, that had developed the specific tactical knowledge required to kill a 5-meter lizard with wooden spears, had every reason to do so. There is another human impact on the Australian environment that deserves serious attention in this context, and it is one that is sometimes overlooked in discussions that focus exclusively on direct hunting. Fire. Aboriginal Australians have been using fire to manage landscape for an extraordinarily long time. The practice of fire stick farming, deliberately setting fire to vegetation to encourage new growth, to drive game, to clear travel routes, to manage the mosaic of habitat types that maximizes both plant food and game availability, is deeply embedded in Aboriginal land management traditions across the continent. The evidence for early human fire use in Australia is substantial. Charcoal records from sediment cores across the continent show a significant increase in fire frequency beginning roughly 50,000 years ago, correlating closely with the estimated timing of human arrival. Researcher Simon Habel of the Australian National University, analysing pollen and charcoal records from multiple sites, has documented this fire frequency increase as a continent-wide phenomenon, not a local or regional pattern. The ecological impact of dramatically increased fire frequency on an ecosystem that had evolved over millions of years under a specific natural fire regime would have been profound. Fire changes vegetation structure. It favours fire-adapted plant species over fire-sensitive ones. It can permanently alter the composition of plant communities across large areas. And altered plant communities mean altered habitat for the animals that depend on them. For Megalania specifically, increased fire frequency would have had several potential impacts. Frequent burning of dense scrub and woodland, the habitat where Megalania's ambush hunting style was most effective, would have reduced the availability of suitable hunting habitat. It would have altered the distribution and behaviour of prey, and it would have increased the frequency of direct human Megalania encounters in the disturbed post-fire environments where both species would have been drawn to the flush of new vegetation and the animals it attracted. Let us also consider the reproductive biology of Megalania, because it is directly relevant to understanding why the species was so vulnerable to even modest levels of additional mortality. All varanids reproduce by laying eggs. Komodo dragons, the best-studied large varanid, reach sexual maturity at approximately 8 to 9 years of age and lay clutches of 15 to 30 eggs. The incubation period is approximately 8 months. Hatchlings are extremely vulnerable, small enough to be prey for a wide range of predators, including other Komodo dragons. Juvenile mortality is very high, and only a small fraction of hatchlings survive to adulthood. This reproductive strategy, low reproductive rate, late maturity, high juvenile mortality, is characteristic of what ecologists call a K-selected species. K-selected species are adapted to stable environments at or near the carrying capacity of their habitat. They invest heavily in each offspring and produce few of them. They are capable of maintaining population stability in undisturbed conditions, but they recover very slowly from population reductions. This is the fundamental vulnerability that made large K-selected species, elephants, whales, great apes, and by extension Megalania, so susceptible to the novel mortality pressure of human hunting. When you add even a modest increment of adult mortality to a population whose reproductive rate is already low, the mathematics of population dynamics quickly become unforgiving. If a Megalania population of, say, 500 adults was experiencing the loss of even 20 additional adults per year to human hunting, a rate of 4% annual adult mortality added on top of the natural background mortality, the population trajectory would be steeply downward. And because juveniles and subadults take 8 or more years to reach reproductive age, the population cannot compensate through increased reproduction in the short term. The giant ripper lizard, for all its size and ferocity, was biologically fragile in exactly the way that its hunters were not. 40,000 years ago, somewhere in ancient Australia, the last Megalania died. We do not know where. We do not know the circumstances. We do not know whether it was old age, starvation, injury, or a human spear that ended the last individual of this extraordinary lineage. We have no grave, no final resting place, no articulated skeleton that marks the spot where 300 million years of reptilian evolution reached its endpoint in a single animal drawing its last breath. What we have is silence. The silence of an apex predator no longer present. A silence that the landscape itself registered in the subtle ways that ecosystems register the loss of a keystone species, shifts in prey behavior, changes in vegetation structure, the absence of the disturbance patterns that a large predator's movements create. A silence that the first Australians may have noticed, and perhaps mourned, and perhaps told stories about. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the disappearance of Megalania was gradual enough, and their lives difficult enough, that the passing of the giant ripper lizard was simply noted and moved on from. Perhaps the last confirmed sighting was filed away in cultural memory as one more piece of landscape knowledge, and then slowly, over generations, forgotten as the animal itself faded from living experience into the territory of the deep. We do not know. We cannot know. What we can say, with the confidence that the evidence allows, is this: Megalania was real. It was extraordinary. It shared this continent with the ancestors of the oldest living human culture on Earth. And its disappearance was part of a transformation of the Australian environment that was, at least in part, the consequence of human arrival. Not through malice, not through any conscious desire to remake the world, but through the simple, inevitable expression of what our species does when it enters a new ecosystem. We change it. Permanently. Irreversibly. We have always done this. We are doing it now. In understanding that, understanding the deep history of human ecological impact, going all the way back to the first footprints on an ancient Australian shore, going all the way back to the world that Megalania ruled before we arrived, is perhaps the most important lesson this entire story has to offer. What we lost. What remains. There is a thought experiment that paleontologists and ecologists sometimes use when they want to convey the true scale of the Australian megafauna extinction. Imagine waking up tomorrow to find that every elephant on Earth is gone. Every rhinoceros, every hippopotamus, every giraffe, every large predatory cat. Gone. Not declining, not endangered, but simply absent, as completely and permanently as if they had never existed. The savannas empty, the forests silent, the waterholes undisturbed. That is roughly what happened to Australia in the space of a few thousand years. And the world that emerged on the other side, the Australia that the first Europeans encountered when they arrived in 1788, the Australia of kangaroos and wallabies and wombats and emus, strange and wonderful as it is, was a diminished world. A shadow of what had existed before. An ecosystem missing most of its largest, most ecologically significant components. The loss of Megalania was not merely the loss of a single species. It was the loss of an apex predator that had been shaping the Australian ecosystem for millions of years. And when apex predators disappear, the consequences ripple outward through the entire food web in ways that are often invisible until you know what to look for. Ecologists call this a trophic cascade, and the evidence for such cascades following apex predator loss is now overwhelming across multiple ecosystems worldwide. The reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park in 1995 is the most famous modern example. Within years of wolf reintroduction, elk behavior changed. The animals stopped overgrazing riverbanks, where they were vulnerable to wolf predation. Vegetation recovered along watercourses. Rivers literally changed course as stabilized banks altered water flow. The presence of a single apex predator, absent for 70 years, restructured the entire ecosystem. Megalania had been absent from Australia for 40,000 years. What did its absence mean for the ecosystem? This is genuinely difficult to reconstruct because the ecosystem it would have regulated was itself largely gone. Most of Megalania's primary prey species disappeared around the same time. But we can make some inferences. Large varanids are significant ecosystem engineers in ways that go beyond simple predation. They are major consumers of carrion, an ecological role that, in African systems, is filled by vultures, hyenas, and jackals. The removal of a major carrion consumer affects nutrient cycling, disease dynamics, and the rate at which large carcasses are processed back into the soil. They regulate populations of medium-sized prey animals, the animals below them in the food web that, in the absence of predation pressure, can expand to the point of overgrazing their own. The Australia that emerged after the Megafauna extinction was, in important ways, an ecologically unstable system. An ecosystem missing its regulatory mechanisms, its population controls, its nutrient cycling engines. The progressive aridification of the interior over the subsequent millennia was driven primarily by climate, but it was likely accelerated by the loss of the megafauna that had maintained the vegetation structure of the interior grasslands and woodlands through their grazing, browsing, and trampling. There is a painful irony in this. The ecological transformation triggered by human arrival, the loss of the megafauna, including Megalania, may have contributed to the very aridification that made large parts of the Australian interior increasingly inhospitable to human occupation. The people who arrived on a productive, well-watered continent helped create, through their ecological impact, the harsher landscape that their descendants would inhabit. The story of Megalania also sits within a much larger global pattern that demands honest examination. Across the world, the arrival of modern humans correlates with the extinction of megafauna with a consistency that cannot be explained by coincidence. North America lost roughly 70% of its megafauna species: mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, American horses, camels, saber-toothed cats, American lions, short-faced bears, within a few thousand years of human arrival, approximately 13,000 years ago. South America lost an even higher proportion. Madagascar, colonized by humans roughly 2,000 years ago, lost all of its giant lemurs, its elephant birds, its pygmy hippos, within centuries of human arrival. New Zealand, reached by Polynesian navigators approximately 750 years ago, lost all 11 species of moa, giant flightless birds ranging up to 250 kilograms, within perhaps a century of human colonization. The pattern is global. The pattern is consistent. And the pattern is, when you confront it honestly, deeply sobering. We are the most ecologically transformative species that has ever existed on this planet. Not because we are malicious, not because our ancestors in Australia or the Americas or Madagascar sat down and decided to exterminate the local fauna, but because our combination of cognitive flexibility, social coordination, technological capacity, and population growth creates an ecological footprint that naive ecosystems that evolved without human presence, are simply not equipped to absorb. Paul Martin, who spent his career developing the overkill hypothesis, called this the prehistoric overkill. He argued, controversially but compellingly, that the megafauna extinctions of the late Pleistocene and Holocene represent the first great human-caused biodiversity crisis, the opening chapter of an ongoing story that continues today in the form of habitat destruction, overexploitation, and climate change. The contemporary resonance of this argument is not lost on anyone paying attention. But I want to be careful here, because the story of Megalania is not simply a story of human destruction, and reducing it to that would be both intellectually dishonest and unfair to the complexity of what actually happened. The first Australians did not arrive as ecological vandals. They arrived as people, resourceful, intelligent, culturally sophisticated people, doing what people do, trying to survive, to feed their families, to understand and manage the world around them. The ecological consequences of their arrival were, in the deepest sense, There was no way, with the knowledge available to them, to foresee that hunting large animals at rates that seemed perfectly sustainable in the short term would, across millennia, contribute to the collapse of an entire ecological community. This is, in fact, the most chilling aspect of the entire story. The first Australians were not doing anything wrong by the standards of any reasonable ethical framework available to them. And yet the consequences were catastrophic by any ecological measure. The lesson here is not that ancient people were villains. The lesson is that ecological systems are complex beyond the capacity of any individual, or any generation, or perhaps any culture operating without access to the accumulated knowledge of modern ecology to fully comprehend. The connections between apex predators and vegetation structure, between megafauna grazing and soil stability, between prey population dynamics and predator reproductive rates. These are relationships that can only be understood through the kind of systematic scientific investigation that did not exist until very recently. We are the first generation of humans to possess, even partially, the ecological knowledge necessary to understand what we are doing to the natural world in real time. That is an extraordinary privilege, and it carries an extraordinary responsibility. What remains of Megalania today? The fossil record, fragmentary as it is, continues to yield new material. Museum collections in Queensland, South Australia, and New South Wales hold the bones that have been recovered over more than a century of paleontological work. Each new fragment adds a small piece to the puzzle of what this animal actually was: its size, its physiology, its range, its ecological relationship. The science of ancient DNA has transformed paleontology in the past 2 decades, allowing researchers to extract and sequence genetic material from fossil specimens tens of thousands of years old. Megalania is, in principle, a candidate for ancient DNA analysis, if sufficiently well-preserved bone material can be found in the right geological context. No successful ancient DNA extraction from Megalania has been published at the time of this script, but the field is advancing rapidly, and the possibility cannot be ruled out. What ancient DNA from Megalania could tell us is remarkable to contemplate. The precise phylogenetic position of Megalania within the Varanid family tree, its relationship to living Australian goannas, possibly glimpses of the genetic basis for its extraordinary size. The molecular history of a lineage that dominated an entire continent for millions of years. The living relatives of Megalania, the goannas of modern Australia, are themselves remarkable animals that carry in their biology and behavior echoes of their giant ancestor. The parenti, Varanus giganteus, is the largest living lizard in Australia, reaching up to 2.5 meters in length. It is a skilled predator, a sophisticated tracker, an animal that commands respect from anyone who encounters it in the wild. Watching a large parenti move through desert scrub, the deliberate, fluid locomotion, the constant tongue flicking that reads the chemical landscape, the calm assessment of potential threats, is to see, in miniature, something of what Megalania must have been. The lace monitor, Varanus varius, is another living echo, a tree-climbing, opportunistic hunter that occupies forest and woodland environments across eastern Australia. It is the animal that, perhaps more than any other living species, inhabits the ecological ghost of Megalania's former range. These animals survived, their giant relative, and the reasons for that difference: smaller body size, faster reproduction, greater dietary flexibility, lower caloric requirements, reduced visibility and value as human prey, tell us something important about the characteristics that determine survival in a world increasingly shaped by human presence. There is a final question that I want to sit with for a moment before we close this story. What did Megalania mean to the people who shared the continent with it? We have touched on this question earlier, the possibility of oral traditions encoding memories of the giant lizard, the aboriginal traditions of enormous goanna-like creatures in the deep past. But there is a broader dimension to this question that goes beyond the specifics of cultural memory. Every human culture that has ever lived alongside large, dangerous predators has developed a complex relationship with those animals, a relationship that goes far beyond the purely practical calculus of threat and response. Lions, bears, wolves, crocodiles, sharks. These animals occupy a special place in human psychology and human culture precisely because of their power, their danger, and the respect they command. They become symbols. They become teachers. They become, in the mythologies and spiritual frameworks of the cultures that live alongside them, something more than animals. The first Australians lived alongside Megalania for thousands of years. They watched it hunt. They avoided it, fled from it, perhaps hunted it. They told their children about it. They incorporated its existence into whatever framework of understanding they used to make sense of the living world around them. And then it was gone. The oldest continuous human culture on Earth carries, somewhere in its deep history, the experience of watching the world's largest terrestrial lizard disappear from the landscape. Of a time when the giant ripper lizard was real and present and terrifying, and then was not. What that experience meant to the people who lived through it, what stories they told, what ceremonies they performed, what explanations they constructed for the vanishing of this extraordinary creature, we cannot know with any certainty. But we can honor the question. We can acknowledge that the relationship between those first Australians and Megalania was real and complex and consequential for both species. And we can recognize that the story of Megalania is not simply a story about a dead animal in a distant past. It is a story about us, about what we are, about what we do to the world when we arrive in it, about the cost of our extraordinary success as a species, and about the responsibility that success carries. A responsibility to understand, as clearly and as honestly as we can, the full consequences of our presence on this planet. Megalania is gone. The giant ripper lizard that stalked the grasslands and woodlands of ancient Australia, that ambushed the giant wombats at the waterhole, that tasted the air with its forked tongue and found the scent of prey kilometers away. That animal is 40,000 years gone, and nothing will bring it back. But its story is not gone. Its bones are still in the ground. Its ecological ghost still haunts the Australian landscape. Its living relatives still move through the scrub with something of its ancient, fluid grace. And its memory, encoded in fossil beds, in sediment cores, in the genetic inheritance of its surviving relatives, and perhaps in the deepest layers of the oldest human stories ever told, persists. The world was stranger once, larger, wilder, more dangerous and more magnificent than anything alive today can fully convey. Megalania was part of that. And understanding it, really understanding it in all its biological complexity and ecological significance and historical weight, is one small way of honoring what was lost when the first humans arrived on an ancient shore and changed everything, forever. If this story made you think differently about deep history, about human impact, about the extraordinary creatures that once shared this planet with our ancestors, leave a comment below. Tell us which prehistoric predator you want us to investigate next. And if you want more deep dives into the lost worlds of prehistoric Earth, subscribe, because we are only just getting started. If this story made you think differently about deep history, about human impact, about the extraordinary creatures that once shared this planet with our ancestors, leave a comment below. Tell us which prehistoric predator you want us to investigate next. And if you want more deep dives into the lost worlds of prehistoric Earth, subscribe, because we are only just getting started.